I'd like to introduce Rajiv Mehta.
Years ago, at the home of Kevin Kelly in Pacifica, we had the first meeting of the Quantified Self. And about 30 people were there, somewhat surprised that there were that many of us. And the very first speaker got us off on a roll. It was this young guy, and he explained to us that he had been keeping track of his activities down to the 5-minute level for the past 3 years. And in fact, he had very fancy color-coded charts to display all of this information. So it's quite amazing that someone is so persistent. But what really floored us was that after he got done with his presentation, he asked us what value could there be in all of this tracking. And so that, of course, really got the conversation going. The person in the photo who's speaking is Professor Seth Roberts, who teaches at Berkeley and at Tsinghua in Beijing. And he has been doing self-tracking and self-experimentation for decades. The fella in the yellow t-shirt over here with the red letters on the back, that's Tim Ferriss. He since has gone on to write the very best-selling book, The 4-Hour Body, based on all of his own self-experimentation. And I'm the guy out here over there. I also spoke at that. But so that was almost exactly 5 years ago. And what I'm going to share with you today are sort of my observations, my learnings, and 5 particular learnings that seem appropriate for this question of what are the business opportunities in this space. So I'm going to talk about market size, feedback loops, sensors, engagement, and really what value are people getting out of all of this self-tracking activity. And again, this isn't a scientific survey, it's really from the people that I've met over the course of the last 5 years. So starting with this issue of market size, one of the ironies in Quantified Self, since it's all about data, is how much there is a lack of data, a lack of clarity on this issue of market size. As you know, this question of, is this an early adopter market, is it still just a niche with a tiny few people doing it, or is this already mainstream? It turns out the indicators we have on this are quite muddy. So in terms of the QS experience itself, from that very first meeting, over the last 5 years, we now have nearly 100 QS meetup chapters around the world, including new ones in Bombay and Bangalore. And almost every night of the year, somewhere in the world, there's a QS meeting going on. We've had 4 conferences today, 2 in the Valley, 2 in Amsterdam. We've got the 5th one coming up in San Francisco in a month. And at these things are almost always packed, so the larger the space we get, the more people seem to show up. And most of what happens at these QS meetings is people talking about their own experiences. We ask them, what did you do, how did you do it, and what did you learn? The other question we've been asking for the last couple of years, just initially out of curiosity, but now sort of has become a habit, is we ask people, how many of you are at a QS event for the first time? And it's been roughly half the audience. So there's every time a lot of new people showing up. So clearly this is growing fast. And yet, you know, honestly, if you add up every single person who's attended a QS event anywhere, it's still a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. So in many ways, this is very much early adopter. So here's Gartner's perspective on the topic. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Gartner's very famous hype chart, they plot new technologies from an innovation trigger up to the height of, peak of inflated expectations, crashing down into the trough of disillusionment, before eventually making it to the plateau of productivity. So, apparently those nerdly analysts at Gartner are good with words. So where do they plot QS? As I'll show you, they seem to want to have it both ways. They've got Quantified Self way on the left, so it's very new. On the other hand, they have it, I'm sure you can't see, but it's with a small light blue circle. A light blue circle indicates that Gartner believes this is going to hit the plateau of productivity in 2 to 5 years. So Gartner seems to be saying that more or less overnight, Quantified Self is going to go from new to mainstream. And, it doesn't seem very realistic. Also, they have mobile health monitoring technologies much further along the cycle, about to really crash, but with a dark blue circle, indicating that they think that's going to take 5 to 10 years before it becomes at the plateau of productivity. So what do you make of this? They're saying that quantified self is going to become mainstream much sooner than the technologies that seem to drive it. So for more confusion, we turn to Pew Research. They do a lot of surveys of the American population. And a recent survey that they published, it came out, I think it was January, February. One of the questions, it was all about surveying people's self-tracking habits. So one of the very surprising things that the report says is that 70% of Americans are tracking at least one health issue. And, 70% is pretty darn mainstream. At the same time, about half of the people who say they track don't use technology. In fact, they don't do anything in their head. So when you ask the more specific question of how many of you are using apps or devices to track, it turns out it's only about 11% of the US population. However, 11% seems pretty darn mainstream too. It's certainly far beyond the early adopter population. And we don't see that from our normal experience. So there's been a lot of discussion online as to whether this is still way an overcount. And some people, in fact, are arguing that it's an undercount because if you count the number of glucometers, blood pressure cuffs, scales, etc., that are sold for the home market, it should be much more than 11%. So how do we make any sense of the data? And Pew seems to know what they're doing in terms of surveys and analysis, so there's something really there. One key issue that comes up in sort of coming up with explanations for this discrepancy is that many people who do tracking don't call it tracking. They're just managing their diabetes. They're not tracking their glucose level. So it's not very clear. On the other hand, industry pundits who sell their reports to companies that to build business are always very optimistic. And here's a reasonably modest projection. Some are much higher than that. And Business Intelligence thinks that next year there's going to be 100 million wearable devices sold, and about over half of them are for health and fitness. So that's a real market. And if we take a look at the crowdsourcing front, there's a lot of interesting success stories. Instabeat is actually a company based in Beirut. They're building a little sensor attaches to your swim goggles, so even while you're swimming, you can get a lot of information. You'll hear soon more from Monisha about Lumobac. Beddit is a Finnish company. It's a little ribbon that's so thin it can go under your bed sheets and does an amazingly good job of tracking your sleep very, very unobtrusively. Emotive is a San Francisco-based company. It's got a headset, measure your brain waves. And Scanadu is trying to build a tricorder. They're also another local company. So from at least the popular support that these companies have gotten through crowdsourcing, there is definitely a lot of interest. But the last point I'll make is that this idea of self-tracking, of self-reflection, is not new. The Buddha and a zillion philosophers before and after him have advised us of the value of listening to oneself, of taking time to reflect and make sense of that. So something that's a few thousand years old can hardly be called new. And so in terms of the market size, I think the only way to make sense of these various indicators is that most people are already doing this. They may not call it that, but if you can tap into what people are already doing, then potentially you'll have a very, very large market. So next I want to move to sensors. And sensors are really what sort of got the quantified self movement going in the first place. The availability of cheap, small sensors that we could wear, track our data. You didn't need to be part of, the San Francisco 49ers to get something that gave you some information about yourself. And in fact, most of the conversations you have around QS, people are very excited about the opportunities to come in these sensors. We've played with a lot of these things already. Rachel and the other folks told us about what's coming, and this is very, very exciting. All sorts of new things that we haven't, that are nowhere close to the market yet, but we sort of in the QS and places are playing with these things. The other key point to mention about this is that it's not a criticism that people are buying these things because they're shiny new toys and trying things out. If that's what gets people to start paying attention to their health, fantastic. So just don't dismiss them because they're only sort of eye candy. In fact, that's what's getting people into this. But it's much, much more fundamental than that. Marcel Proust, the author, spoke that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And these sensors are just that. Just like the telescope and microscope that came before, these allow us to perceive the universe in ways we couldn't before. We're now seeing things that have always been right in front of us, but we just weren't able to see them before. And so that alone makes a huge difference. We discover new things, we learn new things because we're able to see new things. However, sort of ironically and unexpectedly, using all these gadgets has exposed so many and made us aware that we are human beings that have a bunch of built-in sensors that are amazingly good at times. And we find that in using these sensors over time, we actually become much better able to sense things than we could before. So people who use Fitbit and Bodybug and, I got my Shine on, if you're just doing things on a normal way, pretty soon you just know, okay, today I walked about 7,000 steps. You're not accurate down to 6,957, but who cares? You walked about 7,000 steps. Similarly, people who've used a lot of these sleep sensors have gotten to the point where just from how they feel when they wake up, how groggy they are, how fresh they are, they can tell you what their sleep score is going to be. They no longer need to look at their device. And when we think about it, we find that this skill in perception is commonplace. Go to any good mechanic. He can grab the right wrench, the right screw out of his drawer without getting out his calipers. Anybody who's sort of a visual artist can differentiate between subtle shades of color just using their eyes. They don't need to go get a colorimeter. Piano tuners, everyone I've ever hired seems to just do it by listening. So we have amazingly good sensors when they're trained. And so one of the really key questions around these new sensors, these new devices, is whether they are in fact providing us new eyes or they're simply teaching us to see. And with this in mind, we also have to think about these sensors, these gadgets, in a different way. Is the measure of success whether you continue to wear your device all the time? Or is the measure of success whether the user is now able to perceive their world far more accurately than they ever did before, whether or not the device is on them? The other key issue around sensors, which the earlier panel touched on very, very much, is this issue of making sense of the data. Another novelist, a Danish novelist named Peter Hoeg, said that what we discover in nature is not really a matter of what exists. What we find is determined by our ability to understand. And that's a key thing around these sensors. You get this data, but what does it mean? Is it meaningful? What did it actually measure? How does it compare to what I'm interested in? Should I pay any attention? These are non-trivial questions. Many people looked through telescopes when they were first invented. Only a few, like Galileo, actually understood what they were looking at. And this challenge of making sense of data is not something new to QS. This is prevalent everywhere. Many of you may have heard of Nate Silver. He initially rose to prominence because he did some brilliant baseball analysis, if folks have seen Moneyball, that kind of thing. He later got much, much more famous by writing a blog for the New York Times called 538, in which he was far, far more accurate in prediction election results than any of the pundits. And Nate's written this brilliant book called The Signal and the Noise, where he goes into detail in many, many fields, the challenge of making sense of your sensor data. So on this issue of sensors, I want to have it both ways here. This is incredibly exciting. The sensors that already exist, that are coming out in the labs, are sort of fundamental to some of the improvements we want to see. And yet, not every single sensor and not at every single moment. And if you're going to build a business around sensors and gadgets, keep in mind that you're not sensing a car, this inert piece of steel. You're attaching them to real human beings that have their own senses and their own interpretation of what the data means. Another very exciting meme in the world of quantified self, self-tracking, all this, is the issue of feedback loops. And Wired magazine, as they do so often, really captured the zeitgeist of this in this article in June 2011, written by Thomas Getz, who's just a brilliant writer. He really captured the essence of why everybody's so excited about the issue of feedback loops. I mean, the basic idea seems to be so straightforward. Measure something important, compare it to your goal, adjust something in your life, measure again, and hey, pretty soon you're going to hit your goal. And if you go to Quantified Self meetups and the conference, you'll hear lots of such success stories. And you're going to hear later from Sky, who has his own personal success stories, and he'll tell you about some of the people he's worked with, where they have been able to do amazing things because they've been able to measure things, make changes, and get that feedback loop going. At the same time, the vast majority of QS experiments don't amount to much. Like the vast majority of people that go to Weight Watchers, they don't lose much weight. And as any of you that are part of IEEE, IEEE know quite well, feedback loops are not a new idea. This wonderful poster from a design firm called Doubly Design sort of just showed that it's the same thing in so many different fields. This is not a new idea. The good thing about that is that we have deep knowledge about feedback loops to help us understand why are there some successes and why are there so many failures. One key point, if you've ever tried to create feedback loops and control systems and so forth, is that the thing that you can control, your actuator, has to have some meaningful impact on the variable that you care about. Otherwise, your feedback loop is really not worth anything. It's like turning the thermostat in your house and hoping the temperature outside is going to change. It just doesn't work. And so oftentimes we find that the controls at our disposal, the ones we have control over, really just don't have any impact on the thing that we care about. And Nate Silver has this nice quote that it's like applying sunscreen and claiming it protected you from a nuclear meltdown. Wholly inadequate to the scale of the problem. And this happens all the time. You care about your weight, and so you get a scale and you get your Fitbit, you start eating your broccoli and walk 10,000 steps, and your weight doesn't change. It could easily be because there are other things impacting your weight, your body's weight set point, that have far more powerful effects on your weight than what you're doing. And your body will simply compensate for all that broccoli and walking it's having to put up with. The other thing about feedback loops is that simple feedback loops are often really no match for complex systems. And one of the issues in many complex systems is the issue of time lags, and our body doesn't do things instantly. What you eat, a change in the environment, doesn't show up instantly on the variable that you're tracking. And it's very sort of exciting to talk about tightening the feedback loop. We'll get more data, faster data, we'll get more responsiveness, and that'll solve all our problems. And this idea that tighter feedback loops are the solution, well, it's usually a recipe for disaster. Donella Meadows, who's written a brilliant book on sort of a primer for understanding systems, talks about the fact that if a decision point in a system is responding to delayed information, the decisions will be off target. Sort of common sense. And if action is taken too fast, it may nervously amplify short-term variation and create unnecessary instability. The point is that time lags play havoc on feedback loops. And many experienced quantified self-trackers, self-experimenters have come to appreciate this. They wait. They track a lot of data, they reflect, they think about it, they do not respond instantly. And in fact, this is a really key takeaway for those of you who might be interested in making businesses around this, that you're going to have some brilliant sensor, you're going to have some wonderful app, and it's going to tell people what to do. Well, it probably won't work. And you're far better off designing products that are going to provide feedback for the user's own reflection. Promise them food for thought. Don't promise them magic answers. Another very popular meme is the issue of engagement, behavior change, motivation, the idea that these apps and devices is going to somehow get you to do what you're supposed to do. And in fact, so many people come to the world of self-tracking, to quantified self, because they have something that they want to change in their own lives that they've struggled to do. So they built their own tools. And the idea is that I'm going to hack my behavior and then I'm going to share my learning with everybody else so that we can together hack yours as well. As it turns out, because of this spirit, there's been tons of experimentation in the world of QS. People have tried, dollars and points that you win when you achieve your goal, that you get penalized if things go wrong. The idea of public commitments because, hey, if lots of people are cheering you on, you're much more likely to succeed. And the shame of public failure will keep you motivated and so forth. So lots and lots of experiments. Basically, what we've come to learn through all this QS experimentation is that the experts actually seem to know what they're talking about. So one such expert is B.J. Fogg, a professor at Stanford who's a very popular, very influential lecturer and consultant in the space of technology for behavior change. One of the things that B.J. emphasizes is that lack of motivation is almost never the problem. He recommends, if you're going to build tools, don't be building tools to try to change motivation. Build tools to make it easier to do. And BJ has this wonderful chart. He's brilliant at sort of summarizing all this research into things most of us can easily grasp. Points out that a behavior requires motivation as well as ability, and that in practical circumstances, the problem almost is that things are too hard to do. He also emphasizes the importance of triggers, that something has to remind you at the right moment that something needs to be done. So BJ emphasizes that we're spending too much time worrying about motivation when it's really triggers and ability that are lacking. And this is really just a simple summary of decades and decades of behavior research, which have basically said that all this excitement around carrots and sticks and external motivations, really, they don't do much. They work a little bit in very rare circumstances. Most of the times they won't get you anything and will likely be counterproductive. And this book by Daniel Pink called Drive is a wonderful lay summary of, honestly, decades of behavior science. The other thing that they say is that if you really want things to happen, make it easier for people to do what they already want to do. And some of the most successful sort of self-tracking, quantified self-types of products have really achieved this. If you go back to the original Nike Plus, that's where had the little gadget that went in your shoe that tracks your running and so forth. Or if you look at very popular apps like MyFitnessPal or Runkeeper, they're all designed to make it easier for you to do what you want to do. They're supporting you, not nagging you. And this is what's really, really key. If you're going to develop products and services in this space, focus on making it easier. Support people's intrinsic motivation. And as Rachel had commented, making it easier includes make it more pleasurable, make it beautiful, make it fun, but make it easier. The last topic is, go through rather quickly, is this issue of value. What value are people getting from doing this thing? And it's surprising. So as I said earlier, if you go to QS meetings, you hear about all these success stories. People have done wonderful things. Well, it's mainly because people like to talk about successes. If you actually talk to them offline, you'll discover that most QS experiments don't really amount to much. People's weight hasn't changed, their sex life hasn't gotten better, whatever it is that they're trying to do really hasn't changed a whole lot. And yet, you sort of ask why. Well, partly because it's hard. We've just talked about all of these difficulties with complex systems and devices and so forth. And partly because it's really bad science. We seem to have failed in our attempts at teaching the general public how to do good science, how to do good experiments. It's, most of the QS talks that I hear, they're kind of scary. And yet, when you ask people, well, what do you think of it overall? Most of them seem to have enjoyed doing it. most of them will tell you that they learned something about themselves. And this is really, really key. They learned something, they enjoyed it because they were involved in what they were doing. They were paying attention to themselves, they were trying things, and so forth. They were really engaged. And we talk about finding the unexpected discoveries, which only happen if you're involved. So as a couple of examples, a couple of years ago, I started tracking my sleep because I had this impression that I was sleeping really badly and needed to do something about it. After a few months of this, I came to discover I didn't have a sleep problem, but I had a much richer appreciation of the normal ups and downs of life. Another QSer talked about her experiments to try to lower her budget. She felt she was spending too much money on energy in the house. Well, after a few months, it was hardly worth the trouble. But in the process, she came to discover how much she enjoyed sort of the meditative rhythms of line drying her clothes. So even though she's saving no money, her life is much better now. And these things only happen if you allow the user to be involved. So on this issue of value, if you design products that are designed so paternalistically, where all the magic is behind the curtain, it's going to sense this, it's going to tell you what you're going to do. As I've just discussed, it probably isn't going to work anyway. But you've also left out the part that most people are in fact finding really valuable, the engagement with themselves. So if you're going to develop things, I really highly stress this lesson from this guy who was somewhat successful, that the journey is the reward. So just to close, if you want to learn from these early adopters yourself, you're welcome to come. There's meetups all the time. The next one is in San Francisco next week. The conference is coming up in a month. And you'll be hearing from 3 panelists who've been doing this as a business. So thank you.